Hi, my name is Hannah Buckland, and I'm the Director of Library Services at Leech Lake Tribal College in northern Minnesota. This is not Leech Lake Tribal College. This is the inside of my car, and this presentation is not live. I'm going to be attending a national summit on digital inclusion on May 16th, so instead of presenting this live, I am recording it in April. This schedule conflict really gave me an interesting opportunity to play around with format and be creative, which was fun. So instead of putting you through the agony of 30 minutes of my disembodied voice narrating a PowerPoint, we're going to get outside and see some things and learn some things and talk about Tribal College library catalogs. At the end of this presentation, because I can't be there to answer your questions immediately, there will be a link to a form where you can submit your questions. I'll leave that open probably till the end of the day if I remember to close it. And then hopefully by the end of the week I'll be able to answer your questions and have those sent back out to you. We have a lot to talk about and not a whole lot of time, so let's go ahead and get started. This actually, I learned it requires me to duct tape the camera to my dashboard, so hold on just a moment.
Little darling, it's been a long, long, lonely winter. Little darling, it seems like years since it's been here. Here comes the sun. Here comes the sun. And I say, it's alright. Little darling, the smiles are returning to the faces. Little darling, it seems like years since they've been there. Here comes the sun. Here comes the sun. And I say, it's all right.
This is my version of a commute. It's 18 miles and takes about 20 minutes when the roads aren't icy. Today is a beautiful Saturday, but within the next couple days, the same road is going to look like this. So we'll use the magic of video editing to draw today's drive out to 30 minutes and enjoy all the sunshine that we can. I wanted to take you with me on this drive, in part to heal the broken souls of all of you who live in cities surrounded by concrete all day, and also to start a conversation about stories, about the stories we tell and retell and call history, about history, which, when retold improperly, doesn't always equate to truth, about language, which is our medium for building and retelling and remembering our stories, and about metadata, which is the language within the context of the library that we use to organize and recall and share stories. And what better place to tell stories than on the road, this in-between place dislodged from the beginning, but not yet at the end, this in the middle place where stories happen. But first, I should tell you where we are and where we're going. Right now, we're here in Bemidji, a town in north-central Minnesota with a soaring population of almost 15,000 people, making it the largest city for about 100 miles in any direction. Bemidji sustains itself in part with a single-gate, single-terminal, 2 flights per day airport, a curling facility that routinely produces Olympians, and an 18-foot-tall statue of Paul Bunyan accompanied by Babe the Blue Ox. You can actually watch a 24/7 live stream of Paul and Babe on the Chamber of Commerce's website if you want to be entertained by tourists in the summer. Bemidji is also home to the Paul Bunyan Subshop, Paul Bunyan Broadcasting, Paul Bunyan Mall, Paul Bunyan Playhouse, Paul Bunyan Transit, Paul Bunyan Mini Storage, Paul Bunyan Trail, Paul Bunyan Elementary School, and of course, the Bemidji High School Lumberjacks. And then there's National Paul Bunyan Day, which, if you're looking for a reason to wear red and black flannel in the middle of summer, is coming up soon on June 28th. Some call it obsession, but words matter, and so Bemidji calls it pride. So actually, right around here is where we started our drive today, on the shoulder of Elliott Road, near where I live, along a stretch of the Mississippi River, which is so narrow and windy up here that we'll actually cross it 3 different times today. And here's where we're going. Leech Lake Tribal College is located on the Leech Lake Nation in the town of Cass Lake. The Leech Lake Nation covers over 1,300 square miles, about a quarter of which is water. The population of Cass Lake is 770, and the Leech Lake Nation's total population is about 10,800 people, spread throughout 15 or so tiny communities, some of which are over 50 miles apart. LLTC is small, under 200 students, and rather than hear me blather about the college's history and mission, we'll listen to some alumni.
The Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe established the Leech Lake Tribal College by tribal resolution in July 1990. Leech Lake Tribal College started in the old legal service building with only one classroom, and classes were held at various areas on the reservation. The college looks to fill a much needed and useful role in the community by educating its own people and creating the next generation of leaders.
There was times when I thought that nothing more would come of Leech Lake Tribal College, and I'd be the only graduate ever from it because we didn't know if it was going to be around the next year or anything like that.
It took 10 years after graduation for me to say, hey, I think I should start college.
I was raised very poor, and at the age of 12 I worked full-time to help my parents pay the bills and provide food for my siblings.
We were in the rented buildings in downtown Cass Lake, and the old abandoned church basement, and with the leaky roof, and the wing of the high school that had yet to cave in.
In 1994, the college upgraded and moved to the former Cass Lake High School, which was a huge success and increased student enrollment. As enrollment at the college increased, so did the confidence and empowerment of the students.
I think some of my biggest challenges were coming out of my shell. I really stayed to myself and really did not want to interact with other people. I just wanted to go to class and be done, but that's not education. That's not anything close to education.
There's that old saying that education today is our bows and arrows. And that's absolutely true, because if we're going to empower communities, and we have to do that through the validation of education. A tribal college is not a university or a community college, and that is that we are grounded in Anishinaabe values, culture, and our language.
It all comes from an Ojibwe perspective. The way the college was designed, the way the coursework was designed, it was very deliberately put in there to reflect Ojibwe culture.
I never went to school in a school that is based around our values and that had our traditions and our culture, and just had the history embedded throughout the school. I learned a lot. I learned a lot about myself. It was just a growing experience.
All through my life I knew I was an Indian, but I didn't know who I was until I came to college here and understood the language. And language put that all into perspective for me. It really did.
In 2013, a successful fundraising campaign allowed Leech Lake Tribal College to break ground for its state-of-the-art library. Increasing the space by nearly 8 times, the new building will also house the Learning Center, a smart classroom, an archive of documents and artifacts. As Leech Lake Tribal College continues to grow, so will the number of empowered lifelong learners and leaders advancing the Anishinaabe worldview.
I am on the cusp of graduating from St. Thomas Law School and will be taking the bar exam very soon.
I really didn't want to leave a tribal college.
We live day to day on the reservation, we really do. So this institution here plays a bigger role than some may think.
Leech Lake Tribal College, a culture of success.
In that video, you heard that LLTC broke ground on a new library in 2013. After a year and a half of construction, we opened this library in 2015, moving from a 945 square foot room to an 8,002 square foot building. From the moment we first unlocked the doors on February 4th, 2015, we've been dedicated to providing library services for both the college and the community, operating as a joint-use academic and community library, and as the only library that serves the entire Leech Lake Nation. We teach information literacy to students, just shy of 30 sessions this past semester. We handle every step of acquisitions and cataloging. We provide year-round early literacy outreach to over a dozen community organizations. We coordinate community computer classes, up to 14 per week, held in 4 different locations. We're in the process of renovating our archive room and developing a digital asset management system that is responsive to cultural access protocols. We keep our doors open 6 days a week during the school year, 5 a week during the summer, and we do all of this with just 3 full-time employees, so me plus 2 other people, a budget that depends entirely on grants, and if we're lucky, 1 student worker. I know in my session description I promised you metadata and catalogs, and we will arrive there eventually, but first we need to take a detour to talk about stories, about history, about colonization, and about truth. because I think the broader question of why does this matter is more significant for this context than what is my library doing. It's important to note that during this presentation, I will occasionally use the words Native or Indigenous rather than naming specific tribes, which is not at all to imply that there is one homogeneous or shared culture that is Native. There are over 600 unique tribes, there are over 600 unique cultures. Also, content that follows during the next 5 or so minutes will include discussion of racism, cultural genocide, colonization, destruction of traditional lands, the boarding school era, and the New Ulm massacre of 1862, so please take whatever precautions necessary if these are sensitive topics for you. We'll start here with a story about home, about the history of here, and we won't start at the beginning because I don't know the beginning. Instead, we'll start in 1834 with this man, whose name is Sheenawashkung, meaning the one who rattles. He was born after the beginning of the removal era, in or around 1834, well after colonization had begun. When he was 3 years old, on July 29, 1837, the Ojibwe tribes signed a huge land cession treaty. This treaty gave the U.S. title to the land while simultaneously claiming to grant Ojibwe people the privilege to hunt, fish, and gather, as if to imply, from the viewpoint of white supremacy, that Indigenous lifeways are an opportunity white people have provided rather than a basic human right. Article 5 of the Treaty of 1837 makes this stance very clear, reading as follows. The privilege of hunting, fishing, and gathering the wild rice upon the lands, the rivers, and the lakes included in the territory ceded is guaranteed to the Indians during the pleasure of the President of the United States. This single sentence exemplifies colonization. It functioned to establish white control over Ojibwe and Dakota tribes, and it did this by redefining basic access as a federally controlled privilege. Treaties like the Treaty of 1837 also affirmed white control over access to information. Access to information and the resources to share and save information are necessary in sustaining and strengthening tribal sovereignty, or a tribe's right and ability to self-govern. So, of course, white supremacists have used and continue to use deprivation of information as a weapon, as a way to assert dominance, define information access as a privilege, silence people's voices, reshape the stories we regard as history, and erase the truth. If you think about these treaties in terms of colonization, they were documented and shared in a capacity that ensured white control. They were written down, which contradicts the Anishinaabe oral tradition, they were only in English, so the language of the oppressor, and they were physically stored in faraway Washington, D.C. Treaties like this marked the removal era of the first half of the 1800s, in which white federal officials physically removed Native people from their homes. When Sheenawashkung was 16 years old in 1850, the Federal Bureau of Indian Affairs forced Ojibwe tribes in Wisconsin and Michigan westward by moving the location of fall payment of annuities and supply provisions from a central location in Wisconsin west to Sandy Lake, Minnesota. Needing supplies and payments for survival, nearly 3,000 Ojibwe people walked from their homes, arriving at Sandy Lake in October. But when they arrived, the annuities weren't there. In early December, a fraction of the total payments arrived along with spoiled, moldy food. During the weeks in between, about 150 people had died, and over 200 more died walking home. The allotment era that followed deliberately severed lines of communication, fracturing families, clans, and tribes as the U.S. government assigned individuals to land plots, often in isolated areas away from tribal homelands where traditional food was unavailable and Western infrastructure, like running water, electricity, phone service, and now broadband access, was and is slow to reach. In 1862, Dakota tribes in southern Minnesota fought back against the white settlers who were stealing their homes and starving their families. As fighting intensified, Sheenawashkung publicly addressed his own community and persuaded them to not join the battles. In southern Minnesota, following the battles, President Abraham Lincoln ordered the hanging of 38 Dakota men, the largest mass execution in U.S. history to date, and removed about 270 more Dakota men from Minnesota to an internment camp, Camp McClellan, in Davenport, Iowa. In 1882, following the death of his wife, Sheenawashkung moved about 20 miles west along the Mississippi River to Bemidji, where he became a leader in a community of 50 or so people. Sheenawashkung communicated with the white settlers who began arriving in the area in 1888, who instead nicknamed him Chief Bemidji, a reference to the Ojibwe word Bemidji-Gamog, which is the word for the big lake in Bemidji, a word describing the way the Mississippi River flows crosswise through the lake. Bemidji was incorporated as a town in 1896, and 2 years later, in 1898, when Sheenawashkung was 64, the railroad arrived in Bemidji, with a line of ties planned to cross the land where he lived. He resisted, but officials removed him, leveled his house, and relocated him and the rest of his community to land allotments some 20 miles away, where he later passed away in 1904 at age 70. Around the time of Sheenawashkung's death, the boarding school era began, aiming to, in the words of the founder of the Carlisle Indian School, kill the Indian in order to save the man by stripping Native children of their culture. With respect to colonization, this was carried out by removing children as young as 5 from their homes, cutting their long hair, dressing them in Western clothes, forbidding them from speaking their first languages, expressing their culture, and practicing their traditions, and by training them for menial vocations. Children's minds were also colonized through indoctrination. Teachers preached only Christianity, which students were forced to practice, and teachers renamed children with names like Mary and David and Joseph and Elizabeth. Children were treated horrendously. The labor of children is carried on in Indian boarding schools, wrote one federal official in 1928, not even 100 years ago, would constitute a violation of child labor laws in most states. Nationwide, boarding school enrollment reached a peak of about 60,000 children in the early 1970s. After leaving boarding schools, young men and women were caught between worlds. Those who returned home to their families faced communication barriers, having been made to forget their first languages, and those who moved to cities by white design were unable to find work except in low-paying positions. Tribal colleges and universities respond directly to this colonization and seek to reclaim culture through higher education. The first tribal college, Dene College, was chartered by the Navajo Nation in 1968. More tribes followed, and today 37 tribal colleges, which are governed by the tribes they serve, operate in the U.S. Minnesota has 4, Leech Lake, Red Lake, White Earth, and Fond du Lac, all awarding 2-year degrees and persisting in the face of huge financial challenges. Most tribal colleges, including LLTC, receive the majority of their funding through grants, mostly through federal agencies like the National Science Foundation, the Department of Education, and the USDA. Within IMLS, the Native American Library Services grant programs, which ALA has not urged its membership to fight for during these past couple months, provide critical baseline support and expansion opportunities for tribal libraries across the country. Tribal colleges are a step toward decolonization, and their libraries are part of this effort. But the idea of a library can be problematic. Traditional in Anishinaabe culture, elders are the highly respected keepers of knowledge, passing information down to younger generations. With this in mind, the notion of collecting and storing and accessing information through these buildings called libraries, when viewed within the context of Indigenous history, is a form of colonization. Libraries are these pieces of infrastructure, introduced by white settlers, which, if mismanaged, have the potential to override rather than support the traditional role of elders. I'm white, and while I love my job, I will never be the right person for it. A person belonging to the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe needs to be in this role instead, someone who understands Anishinaabe history and culture and language in ways that I never will, which in part requires confrontation and undoing of the whiteness that shapes library education and careers. To have a white librarian working at a tribal college, making final decisions about what metadata to use, what information and stories to retain, what information and stories to remove, is an offshoot of colonization. The same goes for decolonization of tribal college library catalogs and the descriptive metadata they contain. Language is intellectual infrastructure. It's how we come to know the world around us, how we come to understand our relationship to other things, how we come to recognize the relationships between things that aren't us. Within library catalogs, all descriptive vocabularies, like Library of Congress subject headings, are subject to bias based on the culture whose values they reflect. But when the values of one culture involve oppression of another, that's not bias, that is racism. With LCSH, this is plainly visible. Take, for example, the subject heading assigned to materials that discuss Leech Lake. It's Leech Lake Indian Reservation. Whose words are these, and what was their original purpose? As mentioned earlier, the U.S. government deliberately fractured Native nations and assigned people to small allotments. Colonization is reinforced in the values of this subject heading and the approximately 320 other LC subject headings that use reservation in place of nation or whatever is preferred locally when describing sovereign tribes. This is what a colonized catalog looks like. The process of finding information requires people to adopt and employ colonizing white supremacist language and frameworks. Take 2, for example, the names of people. While Shenawishkung does not have a name authority file, a father-son set of Ojibwe leaders from central Minnesota, both named Buginagijig, do. But the authority file for both names is Chief Hole in the Day, which is what white settlers called them. The Ojibwe version of Buginagijig, the elder's name, is included, but because Ojibwe-Moan evolved without the Roman alphabet, spelling variants are very common. Yet only one Ojibwe spelling is included, and only for one of the files. Beyond subjects and names, classification schemes, and I'm going to pick on LC again here because that's what we use locally, also demonstrate colonization. Class E, labeled The History of the Americas, is where books about Ojibwe culture are located, as if to imply Native culture is a long-gone remnant of the past, and as if to claim Native history exists only within the relatively short timeline of U.S. history, when in reality the opposite is true. E81 through 83, which is labeled Indian Wars, indirectly credits the brutalities of war to Native people, reinforcing the stereotype of the warrior while totally omitting the reality that Native people who chose to fight were defending their homes and families from white settlement. And subclass PM, which is where you will go if you are looking for an Ojibwe language dictionary, carries the label of Hyperborean, Indian, and artificial languages, placing the very real, very complex Ojibwe language on the same shelf as Klingon and Elvish. Instead of directly addressing more particulars of metadata in tribal library catalogs, I want to use the last of our time here to instead address descriptive metadata by way of metaphor, by way of story, by way of history, and by way of truth, which means there is more sensitive content, including discussion about racism and a hateful quote originally delivered in reference to the New Ulm Massacre of 1862, coming up. So let's return now to Bemidji, where in the same park as Bemidji's beloved statues of Paul and Babe, another statue, erected in 1898, was intended to portray Shenawishkung. It was the same year the railroad replaced his home and 38 years before the statues of Paul and Babe would arrive. This is what it looked like. After the statue began to deteriorate, it was replaced with another statue in 1952. This replacement statue, which was wood coated in fiberglass to slow deterioration, looked like this, and has been described recently as cartoonish, a comical rendition, and appearing as if made of Play-Doh. Statues, like words themselves, are symbolic of something larger, something more complex, something that never exists in isolation but is rather part of a long and complicated history. So what does it mean, then, when a statue, symbolic of a real man, not only looks like a caricature, but is also placed within close proximity to a statue of Paul Bunyan? Paul Bunyan never lived in the real world, and what's more, as a character who is labeled as a folk hero for his fabled ability to clear-cut entire forests with the single swing of his axe, he is essentially a celebrated symbol for white supremacy and colonization. And Bemidji, at least white Bemidji anyway, looks at this, plasters it everywhere, and calls it not racism or colonization, but rather hometown pride. Today, Bemidji's population is about 80% white. In 2009, a survey of area residents documented a long-known but rarely publicized disparity. When asked if the Bemidji area is welcoming to everyone, 71% of white people agreed, compared to 27% of Native people living in Bemidji and just 12% of Native people living on nearby tribal land. Moreover, 80% of white respondents rated Bemidji's race relations as fair, good, or very good, while the majority of Native participants rated these relations as poor. The next year, in 2010, a grassroots effort began to replace the Play-Doh version of Shenawishkung, and in 2011, the Bemidji City Council issued a unanimous vote to allow the project to seek grant funding. In 2012, a sculptor based out of Olympia, Washington, was selected from a field of 23 candidates and began working with a committee from Bemidji as well as Shenawishkung's descendants to create a realistic and respectful memorial. However, in April of 2015, a month and a half before the statue's planned unveiling in early June, the Bemidji City Council made regional headlines, which is unusual for small-town politics, during a debate that centered around the language proposed for the 4 informational plaques being installed alongside the statue. In a classic and very public display of white fragility, the all-white council centered their debate on truth-telling and history. The plaques included open, uncensored truths about the history of race relations and colonization in Minnesota, including information about broken treaties, assimilation, relocation, and the destruction of Anishinaabe homelands. Had this information been a part of the project from the beginning, stated one dissenting councilperson, I don't think I would have been in favor of the funding we gave them. Another councilperson who also voted no on the languages presented was especially offended by a quote, a very hateful quote, from a white trader, Andrew Myrick, who, in 1862, as Shenawishkung prevented his community from joining the Dakota in the New Ulm Massacre, said, in reference to the Native people who were starving in southern Minnesota, "So far as I am concerned, if they are hungry, let them eat grass or their own dung." That statement, said the councilperson, is an insult. It's an insult to the white population. It holds no value. Ultimately prioritizing truth and reconciliation, the language on the plaques passed without revision in a 4-3 vote, and in June 2015, the final statue, 9 feet 3 inches tall, bronze, and lifelike, was unveiled at a public ceremony. At this ceremony, Elaine Fleming, longtime history instructor at Leech Lake Tribal College, delivered the keynote speech.
Hello, my relatives. Excuse me if I just cry a little bit. I'm just really so very full of joy. This path that we walked has been really difficult, and I'm just so glad to be a part of this group of people and to be here with you all today. You know, there's a story, one of our stories, and they say that in the beginning all there was this rattling sound. And you know, these stories that we tell, they have no beginning or end. They always start somewhere in the middle. And this one, my aunt was Kathy Hedberg. She was married to Gabby. And she told me that this one that rattles, that it rattles away the bad feelings, the fears, the anger, and it helps us to be well. And that's what this is about. To tell the truth of our history is about wellness, about being well. I really cannot tell you how important this is to me and to our people to share and to know our history. I cannot tell you how important that is. Shenaushkang, he was, we think he was born about 1834. We don't know. 1834. And we know he died in 1904. And I cannot begin to tell you all the things that happened to the Ojibwe people in those 70 years of his life. It's unimaginable what happened to our people. And yet here we are today. He was a good man. And he wanted peace. And he followed all the rules. And now we honor him today, the one who rattles. Look what he's doing for us today. And it's because of the Ojibwe people too, and our friends who tell the truth about history. Because we can heal through history about the truth. That's the way things are supposed to be. So I'm just really truly grateful, because when this whole project started, I would talk to this old grandpa. I put my tobacco out and I'd talk to him. And I'd ask him to teach me. And so I'm grateful to be a part of this group. I'm grateful for what he's done for us, for this one who rattles, and for this good path that we're on, this path of healing. Stay.
Truth-telling, reads the final of the 4 plaques installed near the Shenauishkung statue, is the basis for acknowledgement of injustice and suffering and the restoration of human dignity. Descriptive metadata, as an expression of the stories we tell and retell, as a way of situating and framing history, is one layer of this truth, and as librarians, it's our professional responsibility to uphold and promote this actively. Neutrality is another way of saying complacency, which is another way of saying everything is fine as it is, which is another way of denying the atrocities throughout history that have led to today's inequities. However, revision of a single subject heading, or even many subject headings, as with installing a statue, does not on its own altogether resolve deep-rooted injustices. Only dismantling and recreating the entire framework can do that. Dismantling, though, happens piece by piece and starts locally. The place we are now in this work is neither the beginning nor the end, but rather the middle, the very long, very complicated middle, where all the hard work must happen to ensure stories are not only held on our shelves, but also held in respect, and that history is not only remembered, but remembered truthfully.